Then you throw me into the mix, and trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Ellie Costello, and thank you so much for joining us here on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's election channel.
And when the big stories break, we're tackling them on Britain's newsroom. When we disagree, and we disagree a lot, it's even livelier than normal.
We don't disagree that much.
We do.
His comedy, though, is revolting. I knew her, unlike you.
That explains Beverly Turner's temperament.
It's a bit frosty in here, isn't it?
You'll have one of me one day.
Yeah, for dartball practice. Britain's newsroom on GB News. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes. Thank you for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians and the media, but it's actually about you. We won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear all sides
as you make your decision in the run-up to polling day.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, I'm Tom Harwood, Deputy Political Editor of GB News, bringing you the State of the Nation tonight. The GDP numbers are in and it's a shocking reveal. No economic growth during the month of April. None. Zilch. Many might blame the weather, others might perhaps blame Brexit, but I'll be bringing you my very own theory that explains far, far deeper than either of those factors. And the Green Party has issued its manifesto, which includes a wealth tax on the wealthiest in society. But will it be long before jokes about being green with envy begin? We'll be getting into another GB News exclusive as Stephen Edgington reveals more civil service wokery working against the Conservative government. Plus, do Brits have a drinking problem? The Germans seem to think so. As it emerges, authorities have halved the strength of beer in England's first game in the Euros. Halved that strength. Well, the State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my panel, the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and the writer, broadcaster and occasional GB News presenter Emma Webb. That's all coming up after your very latest headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Tom, thank you. Good evening. The top story from the GB Newsroom tonight. The Prime Minister and the Labour leader are facing questions tonight ahead of the release of Labour's electoral manifesto tomorrow. During the Q&A session, Sir Keir Starmer said that his party's manifesto will focus on wealth creation, adding there'd be no tax rises for working people.
Nothing requires us to raise tax. And I tell you, I do want to... You'll challenge me and I want to deal with this. I want to do things differently. I want to grow our economy. I accept that previous Labour leaders have sort of pulled the tax lever every single time and driven up spending. I want to grow our economy. The manifesto tomorrow will be a manifesto, a plan for wealth creation. Now, you may not hear a Labour leader say that very often, but for me, that is the most important thing. And therefore, I'm not going to do what other Labour leaders have done and be tempted to simply say every time we're going to pull the tax lever. We're not going to do that.
Sir Keir Starmer. Well, earlier on today, Rishi Sunak insisted he hasn't given up hope of winning the election, but he has warned voters not to give Labour a blank cheque. The Prime Minister was campaigning in a school in Lincolnshire as new figures showed the economy had recorded no growth in April. It's something of a setback after his recent claim that Britain's economy had turned a corner. The Tories pointed to figures that show there was growth in the months before April, but the Liberal Democrats said Rishi Sunak had utterly failed to deliver on his promises. The Green Party has launched its election manifesto with a promise to tax the super-rich to help mend what they're calling broken Britain. The party says it would tax the wealthiest 1% of workers and would raise national insurance by 8% for those earning more than £50,000. The Greens say it would raise £50 billion, which they want to invest in health and social care in order to, what they describe as, defend and restore the NHS. The Greens have also pledged to bring water companies, railways and the big five retail energy companies into public ownership and build more social housing. In Scotland, MSPs have backed the government and their plans to release prisoners early to ease pressures on the system. Over 500 prisoners will be released in 4 waves, starting at the end of this month. Only inmates serving short sentences of under 4 years who have 180 days or fewer to serve will be considered for release. The Justice Secretary, Angela Constance, announced the move last month, following a spike in inmate numbers and concerns about the current limited capacity of prisons. She was clear that the emergency release is part of a plan that requires long-term thinking. That's the news. For the latest stories, do sign up to GB News Alerts, scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Polly. Now, welcome back to State of the Nation. This morning we learned that the United Kingdom economy experienced no growth in April. Zero. Zilch. Now, across the quarter, the UK is still expected to grow. This is still a recovery. But why on earth is this recovery so bumpy, so sluggish? Well, here's a clue. When Hollywood wanted to build a new film studio on the site of an old quarry next to the A404, well, last week it was blocked. The local council said no. A £750 million investment, with tens of millions for local infrastructure to boot, in an industry that is trying to boom in the UK. And the local politicians told that foreign investment where to go. Zero development, zero growth. When investors tried to build a $3 billion data centre right next to the M25, the government blocked all of that private investment and the jobs that go with it. Get this. On the grounds that it would spoil views from the busy motorway. Yes, spoil the view from the M25. Now, when the largest airport in the country has been heaving and straining to build a third runway, politicians have continually blocked the move for decades. Competitor Paris Charles de Gaulle has 4 runways. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport has 5. Over in anti-growth UK, however, politicians continue to block private investment and hobble our largest airport. Now, when MGM Entertainment Group wanted to invest $2 billion, yes, that's billion with a B, in a state-of-the-art new spherical entertainment venue in Stratford's Olympic Park in East London, the London Mayor said no, waving goodbye to all of that investment, rejecting the high-tech jobs and tech-led growth that came with it. Even those dastardly water companies have been trying to build new reservoirs. But due to rounds of consultations, campaigns from local politicians and decades of local vetoes, no new reservoir in the southeast has been built in the last 30 years. Instead, we face hosepipe bans and more limited construction. Indeed, the Environment Agency is now blocking a cancer hospital. A cancer hospital! On the grounds of a lack of water. If only we could build a reservoir. And as for energy, which I'll remind you is twice as expensive in the UK as it is in the US, it's hard to find a form of energy that parties have supported. Fracking has been banned under the Tories. The Labour Party want to ban new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. The Tories banned onshore wind farms. And the Lib Dems blocked new nuclear power stations when they were in government. For their part, the SNP maintain a ban on new nuclear power in Scotland. As for solar power, project after project is being rejected, all for the sake of the rural environment. And when it comes to offshore wind farms, amazingly, you'll find the Green Party campaigning against them. Is it any wonder we're seeing zero growth? We can choose to be the build nothing country, approve nothing country, allow nothing country. But if we do that, we're choosing to be the high tax country, the low-growth country, a stagnant economy country. There's real low-hanging, easy-to-reach growth out there. All it takes is for politicians of all parties to stop saying no. Well, joining me now is the editorial director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Dr. Christian Niemitz. Dr. Christian, what do you make of my theory here, that actually this growth stuff is not too difficult?
That's exactly right, yes. I mean, that is the reason why the British economy has been stagnant for more than 1.5 decades now. We're not much richer than in 2007. Median incomes are barely higher than they were then. Productivity is barely higher than it was then. And it really is not too difficult to work out why. There are economies in the world where, people write long PhD theses about what's the problem with their economies. Here it is really pretty clear-cut. Investors do want to invest. It's just that every day you read stories like the ones that you've just highlighted. These are not isolated, cherry-picked examples. You can find this from pretty much every day and across the board, across every sector, across the whole country. And then it's no surprise. If you just say no to everything, well, economic activity has to take place somewhere. It needs places, it needs premises, it needs some, it has to take place somewhere, simply.
And yet, why then are we only feeling that pinch now? We had reasonable growth in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. We've had a pretty stagnant level of productivity since the global financial crisis. Have we just started saying no to a lot more stuff a lot more recently?
Well, it is partly that NIMBYs have been getting better over time at weaponizing the planning system in their favour. But then again, it was already an issue even in the 90s, even in the 2000s. It just didn't feed through to the extent that it does today. But there were people in think tanks such as my own, but also some of the allied neighbouring ones, who have been writing about this in the 90s. In our case, we have a publication in 1988, which was already pointing out this problem. It seemed at the time that Britain could still get away with a lot of NIMBYism. It didn't seem to matter that much then, but it's just feeding through into growth rates now.
I suppose there are sort of a number of reasons why the economy can be held back in any given country. And perhaps in the 1980s, there was easy catch-up growth when it came to our very high tax rates, which were reduced, or our incredibly restrictive labour market regulations, which were liberalised. I suppose now that those are back to sort of normal levels of most normal countries, although tax has risen a bit in the last couple of years, perhaps the thing that sets the UK apart from many countries, particularly some European countries, is that we're just so much more restrictive on building things.
That is the factor that makes Britain different from most of its neighbour economies or from other OECD economies. So, of course, I would rather have lower taxes than higher ones, but on tax rates, Britain is really not that unusual. In terms of labour laws, of course, there are lots of things that could be cut back or that are unnecessary. But again, in that aspect, Britain is not unusual. You could say the same about dozens of other economies too. It really is just this restrictiveness, clamping down on economic activity. That is what makes Britain different.
So here's where we get to the political question. Because most economists would say that tighter restrictions on the labour market are going to be bad for economic growth. But the Labour Party is promising to introduce restrictions on the labour market. They're going to have much more powerful unions and all the rest of it. My question is, can they get away with doing that? Can they get away with some things that perhaps free market economists would say would be unambiguously bad for the economy, if, on the other side of the ledger, they liberalise the planning system? Have a look at what the Shadow Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, Peter Kyle, said. He's obviously in the Labour Shadow Cabinet. Pure economic vandalism, he described, blocking the building of that data centre because of the view from the N25. He's saying that the Labour Party would have allowed the construction of that data centre. Can we believe them?
If they are really serious about liberalising planning, then yes, if you get the basics right, if you just allow a lot more economic activity, then you can get away with a lot of bad stuff on the other side. Ideally, you wouldn't do the bad stuff. You would just have good economic policies across the board. But you can compensate for
higher taxes or...
Yeah, so if you look at France, that would be the classic example. France is about in the same league as Britain in terms of GDP per capita. They have much higher taxes, much more restrictive labour laws, but they allow stuff to be built.
So what we could do is just swap. We could stay about where we are, which is low growth, a pretty stagnant economy. But the way we get there is with much higher taxes but easier building, instead of lower taxes and harder building. It's almost like we're swapping one form of stagnation for another one.
That could happen, yes. Ideally, of course, you would have neither of those. You would just have liberal planning laws and liberal labour markets and low taxes. That would be the best of all worlds. But nonetheless, if you really aggressively liberalise planning and get some other things wrong, you can get away with a lot. It really is the planning side that matters.
But of course, you're an economist. You're looking at the numbers here. There'll be lots of people who talk about their quality of life. People that perhaps don't want lots of new homes near them, might not want the noise and the disruption of construction. What about the people who make the argument for quality of life over economic growth?
Well, I mean, NIMBYism, preventing housing construction, preventing investment, preventing the building of infrastructure, that also massively lowers quality of life for a lot of people, especially if we take the housing market, the people who are at the sharp end of the housing crisis, who have to worry about rent increases, who live in cramped accommodations. That has a massive impact on their quality of life, and I think they have a much stronger claim for wanting change in that area than somebody who might be a bit inconvenienced, that there might be their view might be slightly obstructed, or that the countryside might be a little bit further out. I mean, I really have little sympathy with those people.
Well, it will be very, very interesting to see, if we believe the polls, what the next government actually does on this. I have to say, I spoke to the Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Reynolds, a little bit earlier today. He couldn't give me a clear answer on whether the Labour Party would approve the third runway at Heathrow, for example. So even though there's some more construction rhetoric from the Labour Party, will it be all that different? I suppose that remains to be seen. But thank you very much, Christian Niemitz of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Now, amidst the Green Party's pledge to tax the wealthiest in society, after the break, I'll be speaking to one millionaire who wants to be taxed more. At least that's what he says. Stay tuned.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
The woke be with you these days, not the force be with you. And Star Wars, you know, it was the one thing as a kid that brought me and my brother together pretty close, and I love it with all my heart. But ever since Disney took it over, this diversity, equity and inclusion has run rampant throughout it. And actually we've had the actress from the latest Star Wars spin-off, a series on Disney, actually saying that making white people cry was actually what she wanted to do. Have a listen.
When people watch The Hate U Give, what do you want them to walk away with? Because I know everyone has a slightly different feeling.
Well, I mean, white people crying actually was the goal.
Yeah, so that diversity, equity and inclusion running rampant throughout Hollywood and ruining really good franchises. Actually ensuring, apparently, R2-D2, the little robot, you know, that scoots about and gets on the starships and all the rest of it, apparently that could be a lesbian now.
She's half white, this actress. This is what I don't understand. She's half Danish, then half African-American.
I have skin in this game, as you know, with a mixed-race child. Nobody ever sees a mixed-race child as half white. They see them as black.
We used to say that to focus on the colour of someone's skin was rampant racism and therefore we ought to reject it. Now we're saying actually potentially the only thing that we should notice about a person is the colour of their skin.
I don't really think she was actually wanting white people to be sobbing, and it wasn't malicious, but it's just this silly kind of ruination of something that's meant to be entertainment and fun. I wouldn't go as far as to say Star Wars is art. I'm not.
I love some.
It is, you know, excluding people. Yeah. It's actually dividing people. Once again, by the colour of their skin, we are teaching people to not like each other.
The People's Channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akweer, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Tom Harwood. Well, the Green Party launched its manifesto today, and one of its key pledges was to hike taxes on wealth in society. Yes, multimillionaires and billionaires. The party claims as a means of raising at least £50 billion for public services, as well as their very, very expensive climate policies. Well, such taxes could include a 1% tax on wealth of those with assets above 10 million and 2% on those with assets above £1 billion. But why on earth would the rich stick around for that? These seemingly small tax rates would in actuality halve the wealth of a billionaire like Sir James Dyson in the space of 3 decades. It's all cumulative. Well, my next guest, Guy Singh-Watson, is the founder of Riverford Organics and a member of a group called Patriotic Millionaires UK. Now, Guy, please just explain for us, what is Patriotic Millionaires UK?
We're a group of wealthy individuals who believe that the rich should be taxed more so that we can invest in the public services that I think so many people in the UK want to see.
I suppose my first question to you in that case is, do you make voluntary contributions to HMRC?
No, and I think that's a ridiculous assertion. We are campaigning that this should be obligatory. I make donations to charities and I do a lot of charitable work, but no, I don't. I don't take any sort of proactive measures to avoid paying tax. But yeah, no, I don't, and I, get asked that ridiculous question many times.
It just seems quite strange because if the group is called Patriotic Millionaires, your whole idea is that rich people should pay more to HMRC. I mean, you could put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, our highly patriotic Prime Minister could do that, couldn't he? He pays 20% tax. Someone of his income should be paying over 50% if it was taxed, as most people are taxed. He's not setting a very good example. If he did,
are you trying to imply that the Prime Minister is improperly paying tax? Because, of course, as you know, taxation on capital gains is a different rate that multiple governments of different parties have set because they want to encourage investment in this country.
He takes most of his income through capital gains, and typically, with capital gains, you pay anything from 10 to 28%. It's very easy to arrange your fares so that you do pay round about 20%, which is probably the tax rate that most, very rich people are paying. I don't think that's a patriotic thing to do. I mean, when you're on capital gains, you can be paying, on shares marginally less than 20%. And you're not paying any national...
Can we apply some realpolitik
No, I'm
here?
continuing with my point and answering your question. You'll be paying, if you're paying PAYE, you would be paying, with national insurance, over 50%. Why should people who make their money through capital gains pay less than working people? It's just nonsensical.
Well, it's a question that was put to Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor. And, of course, it was the Labour Party that actually lowered capital gains tax.
Yeah, I'm not standing here. I'm not standing here.
The rate that income taxes were because they wanted to encourage investment. And actually, do you know what? Britain got investment as a result of those tax changes and the economy grew faster.
That may coincidentally have been the case, but I can assure you I've spent 40 years building up a business and investing in it. And I can tell you when I was making those investments and working those long days, I was not thinking about what level of capital gains tax I would be paying at the end of my life. And I've never met an entrepreneur who actually made anything, as opposed to just one who sort of traded things, who ever did. I mean, that's not what guides our decisions.
Isn't that precisely the point, though? Of course, there will always be brilliant entrepreneurs who want to make amazing things, and many things will drive them besides the amount of money that they'll make. But also, and perhaps most predominantly, in every wealthy country, in every financial centre in the world, particularly the City of London and New York City, there'll be lots of people who make their money by moving money around. And they can choose to put their money into funding things like investments in the UK that actually have spillover growth effects, or they can choose to put their money elsewhere. My contention to you is that if these taxes on investments are doubled, perhaps more than doubled, as some people are suggesting, as Rachel Reeves, I think, once suggested, that would drive that capital flow elsewhere, reducing investment to the UK and reducing growth.
I mean, people who trade in shares, that may well be the case. People who actually run businesses and make things, I really don't think it is the case, and it's not. And there are people, actually the vast majority of millionaires, I think over 70% of them, actually believe that they should be paying more tax. They do think it's iniquitous. They are patriotic. They want to invest in their country. And it's quite a small minority who will go and offshore their funds into the Cayman Islands and to my mind, act so very unpatriotically and avoid paying their fair share.
Well, of course, millionaires in the past have, of course, donated their own personal wealth towards the country. I think it was Arthur Balfour, our former Prime Minister, who donated anonymously a large proportion of his fortune to pay off war debt after the First World War. Indeed, many people bequeath much of their personal wealth to the state after they die in order to pay down the national debt or pay for public services. Perhaps patriotic millionaires might think about doing similar things, but Guy Singh-Watson, really appreciate your time. Thanks for having a spirited conversation with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
With me now is GB News primetime provocateur, Adam Cherry, who's been looking meticulously at the fine print of this Green Party manifesto, because it's not just wealth taxes on billionaires and millionaires. What else?
No, it really isn't. There's a lot going on here, Tom. So it's a 48-page document. It's a little bit shorter than Labour, and obviously we've got Labour tomorrow.
Half the length of the Tory
Half the
manifesto.
length of the Tory, and I think the Lib Dems are on about 100 pages. But nonetheless, it's packed with quite a lot of stuff. First of all, on tax and spend, it's worth saying that it's not just millionaires and billionaires who will pay more under a green so-called government. It will also be middle earners, because above 50k you're going to start paying more national insurance. But anyway, that's by the by. Right. The main point here is on 48 pages, 46 mentions of a fairer, greener society. Now, you might ask, what does that actually mean? It basically means spending a lot of money, billions and billions here, there and everywhere. So just top-line stuff, we've got, well, first of all, we've got votes for 16-year-olds, PR, all that sort of stuff that you might see in a Corbynite Labour manifesto. That's all there, that's baked in. You've also got $50 billion a year by 2030 on health and social care, $5 billion a year on arts and culture, $8 billion on schools, 29 billion, over 5 years, insulating homes. Not building them, insulating them.
Sorry, these are all billions with a B.
Billions with a B.
Not millions with an M.
No.
I was once told that the best way to learn about the difference between a million and a billion is to think of it in seconds. That a million seconds is around about 11 days, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
11 days is a million seconds. A billion seconds is 31 years. These are quantitatively different things.
Yeah, I mean, they hope to raise 50 to 70 billion via these tax rises, which we've discussed. But the point is, it's not just that. So let's talk about, you mentioned planning. Let's talk about planning and housing. OK, right. So Tories are saying they will build 1.6 million homes over the next Parliament. Labour, slightly under that, 1.5 million, still quite a lot. Not so much with the Green Party. They're not quite as interested in that. They are saying they'll build 150,000 new social homes a year, and then, these are their words, end the so-called right-to-buy scheme. That comes to 750,000 in total.
OK.
And if you look a little bit deeper, they're really aggressively going after the planning. The planning stuff is not quite what you'd hope to see on a manifesto, right? So let's take a look at this. So all new developments must come with access to public services, and green spaces must be protected. They need to maximise the use of solar panels and heat pumps. And by the way, they're going to spend, where is it? I think, 20-odd billion on insulating and
so the new homes that they do build will be very, very expensive to build.
So on this point, they say building thousands of unaffordable homes isn't the answer. And you think, well, part of the reason it'd be so expensive under this manifesto is because they're adding so much to the planning system. It'll gum it up and make it much more difficult to build any houses.
But you can't build it without this, that and the other. Now, goodness me, that is the Green Party. But Adam, you've also noticed something else tonight.
Yeah, you're right. As primetime provocateur, we're going to change tack a little bit here, because earlier tonight, Keir Starmer, during his interview, his leadership interview, used a very similar line. You might have heard this line a few times before, but it didn't quite go the way you'd expect. So take a look at this. This is earlier today.
When I grew up, my dad was a tool maker. He worked in a factory. It's true. My mum was a nurse, and actually we couldn't make ends meet.
Goodness me, that was an audience reaction there earlier today.
Yeah.
Laughing at Keir Starmer.
Yeah, it didn't go so well. As I say, this is a line. The reason they're laughing is because this line is used repeatedly, over and over, and until he's blue in the face. In fact, to prove the point, I think we've got a little montage here to show you just how many times this line has been used and why he's being derided for it. Take a look at this.
My dad was a tool maker. My dad was a tool maker.
He was skilled as a tool maker, highly skilled.
And your dad, I think it's right to say, was a tool maker?
He was a tool maker, yeah. Dad was a tool maker. My dad was a tool maker.
With my dad, he was a tool maker.
My dad was a tool maker. My dad was a tool maker. Dad was a tool maker. Mum was a nurse.
Adam, was Keir Starmer's dad a tool maker?
I think we need some clarity on that issue. We need to speak to the Labour Party to make sure we understand that clearly. No, the reality is, I don't think he can get away with saying this line again. It's just, it's been driven into the ground, and it just goes to show that he struggles with this sort of thing. He's very rehearsed, he's very robotic, and he's finally been caught out on that one.
If he was against anyone other than Rishi Sunak, perhaps we'd be talking about the Labour gaffes in this election. Perhaps it would seem a bit Theresa May-like, a bit robotic, a bit stilted in the way that it comes across. But I suppose his great benefit here is he's up against a government that's been in power for a long time, a global economy that's hit the rocks in the wake of a war and a pandemic. I mean, he's a very, very lucky campaigner. He's a lucky leader of the opposition.
Yeah.
But for all of the reasons why he's a lucky leader of the opposition, he might be an unlucky Prime Minister.
Yeah, his support is broad but shallow, as many have said already. But you can tell just by looking at the polling, on his personal polling. He personally is not a particularly popular politician. Yeah, the Labour Party, as we've already discussed this evening, are miles ahead than over the Conservatives. But him personally, he may struggle once he's in to control the party.
No, really, really interesting stuff. I noticed in the most recent YouGov poll that showed that 20-point lead, as it has been, that 20-point lead for month after month after month. That lead comes about from a very low Conservative figure. Keir Starmer's actually getting a lower share of the vote currently in that latest YouGov poll. Lower than Boris Johnson got in 2019 for the Conservatives. Interesting stuff. Well, thank you, Adam Cherry, for bringing us all of that. Now, after the break, we'll be digging into yet another GB News exclusive, revealing the extent of HMRC, what I'm told is wokery. Plus, I'll be speaking to a former Premier League manager, football manager, about Germany's booze ban on Brits at the Euros.
Evening, time for your latest weather from the Met Office here on GB News. For many of us, it's been a fine day today. Tomorrow, a very different story. A cold start and then it'll turn wet, and particularly in the west, very windy. Here's the reason why. A couple of sets of weather fronts coming in from the Atlantic. Ahead of that, we've had a ridge of high pressure, which, as I said, has brought most of us a fine day. Still one or two showers over northeast Scotland and eastern England, but they are fading away, and generally it's going to be a dry night with some lengthy clear spells, and that's why it's going to turn chilly. Temperatures well down into single digits, even in towns and cities, and some rural spots even lower. So yes, another pretty fresh start tomorrow. Generally a dry and a bright start, but not everywhere. Here comes the rain trickling in towards Northern Ireland and West Wales, along with southwest England. So rapidly clouding over in the southwest through the morning. Much of the Midlands and eastern England will start dry, and with a bit of sunshine, temperatures will soon start to lift. But turning wet across Northern Ireland, it's going to be a soggy day here, increasingly windy too. Most of Scotland will start dry again, though. A cold start here. And then steadily as we go through the day, the cloud and the rain across Northern Ireland will start to spread its way into southwest Scotland up towards the central belt. The rain drifting into Wales and southwest England by lunchtime, and then through the afternoon, some of that rain getting into northern England and the Midlands. Much of eastern England will stay dry through most of the day, along with northern Scotland. But in the west, not only turning wet, but also windy. Unusually windy around these western coasts through the afternoon. Again, feeling pretty cool, particularly with the wet and the windy weather that's moved across northern Scotland for Friday, where it may well linger. Elsewhere on Friday, it's a blustery, gusty day with, yes, some decent spells of sunshine, but a whole raft of showers. So very changeable through Friday. 1 minute it's dry, the next minute you've got a downpour, and that showery picture continuing into the weekend and staying on the cool side.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but actually it's about you.
And we won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear
all sides
as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation at 8:34. My name's Tom Harwood. Now, it's another day, which means another story has broken about the civil service by GB News US correspondent Stephen Edgington. GB News can reveal that civil servants working for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs have been resisting moves against diversity initiatives from the elected government, with these supposedly impartial officials reportedly saying it was their role to fight fascism. Well, Steve has also revealed that civil servants held a reflection session upon the death of African-American man George Floyd in America. Well, joining us now to discuss this is GB News US correspondent Stephen Edgington. And Stephen, break it down for us. What have you found?
On the 22nd of May, civil servants in HMRC held a reflection session discussing the death of George Floyd. This was 4 years after his death. In this discussion, civil servants questioned the government's priorities on tackling so-called wokeness in the civil service. One question put to senior civil servants was, the government is currently attacking EDI, that's equality, diversity, and inclusivity. How are we going to ensure that these policies are protected and well-funded within HMRC? That question was approved by an HMRC HR officer who then put it to these senior leaders. They didn't actually reply to that question. I don't think that's very surprising. Other interesting things that happened in this call, one civil servant, senior civil servant, said that she cried at every single meeting following George Floyd's death. Another civil servant said that they were a race lead for HMRC. They have all these positions within the civil service, race champions, race leads, and so on, where civil servants can volunteer to push their race activism at work. And in this role, they said they invited their cousin, who's a professor of decolonization and race, to a lecture with HMRC civil servants. So I think a lot of civil servants here breaking the civil service code. They're not being impartial whatsoever. And when I put this to HMRC, they vehemently denied that any of that was true. And they claimed that my representation of events, despite the fact I was quoting exactly what civil servants said, was not right.
Pretty extraordinary that the impetus for this was a 4-year anniversary after an African-American man died in America. It is the British Treasury we're talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is extraordinary. One of the comments that one of the civil servants, and by the way, these were all pretty senior civil servants within HMRC, One of the comments was that they had been accused of being racist against white people and of importing American problems to Britain. And they said that one of the positive things that's happened recently is that those comments have now essentially dried up. Now, I think that these people in this reflection session perhaps want to reflect a little bit on those criticisms of themselves. One of the people was talking about being the race lead for Wales, the Welsh region of HMRC in that department. And they said that they'd invited all sorts of people to discuss famous ethnic minority important figures from Welsh history. Now, I can't think of too many of them. So it does seem, again, that they believe they're in this American society, which has had African-American people for hundreds of years. Britain isn't like that. We're not America. And I think these civil servants have totally imported these American ideas on race.
You're quite right to say we're not America, but we do have our own challenges with racism in Britain, although very, very different to how the United States has these challenges. I wonder, is this all imported, or is this actually perhaps a direct consequence of a piece of legislation that was passed in the dying days of the last Labour government, the Equality Act? And after all, the government does have to follow Acts of Parliament, given royal assent, statute in the UK. And doesn't the Equality Act, as it was passed in 2009, actually require a lot of this stuff?
It doesn't specifically compel civil servants to discuss George Floyd's death in meetings. It doesn't compel civil servants to break political impartiality by supporting Black Lives Matter and other political causes. It doesn't compel them to do any of the things that I've talked about that's happened in this call just a few weeks ago. What it does say is that government departments have a duty to foster relations between different groups, essentially between people with different genders or sexes or races or whatever. That can be interpreted in many, many ways. And it certainly is used as a justification by many of these civil servant activists who want to push their own political ideologies within work time and within working hours. So I think you're totally right to, in one part, blame the Equality Act for this stuff. But at the same time, the Equality Act does not specifically state that they should do any of these things. And this is merely an interpretation by activist civil servants.
Well, Stephen Edgington, thank you very much for bringing us yet another exclusive, peering into what is going on within the civil service of this country. Appreciate it. Well, joining me now is my panel, the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and the writer, broadcaster, occasional GB News presenter too, Emma Webb. Tessa, what do you make of this story? Are we importing problems particular to America into the United Kingdom? And is it appropriate in the civil service to be talking about it?
Just watched you two and I sort of feel like I'm existing in a parallel universe. Two young white men doing really well, thank you very much, on a news channel that has been called out for a lack of diversity. Your boss in front of a House of Commons committee saying he would love to employ more people from a diverse background, but whoopsie, only has one presenter of colour.
And many presenters of colour.
You've got one main
Albie Ancona, Nana Raquia.
Okay, two out of an entire legion. You've named two, and we've just had two white men.
Also, diversity is more than just race.
I'm just taking one example. But if you want political diversity, you're all stacked up on the right. So there isn't. My point being that no, but I'm not a presenter. I should be sitting there with Jacob away, but instead it's piloted in a white right-wing man because this is GB News. And you guys are frothing at the mouth, getting angry about people in the civil service, a government body, actually saying we need to make sure that we do have diversity, equality and inclusion.
Any froth.
Well, my point being is that if you don't have diversity, equality, inclusion, you end up with a product that looks like GB News. You're an example of what happens when we don't observe.
It's interesting because I think it might be that a project like GB News is actually something that is offering diversity in what is quite a plain and stale media landscape in this country. But let's bring in Emma Webb. What do you make of all that?
I just think this is absolutely extraordinary. Firstly, I think it's abhorrent that you're attacking Tom on the basis of his race and sex. And secondly,
I'm just saying it's wonderfully ironic.
Please, you've already said your bit. I thought that was a very calm, collected, factual and peaceful conversation, interview that you had there with Stephen.
They were both agreeing with each other, so of course it was peaceful and amicable.
Oh, well, this is why we can have it out now, Tessa, because there's diversity of opinion on the show, because we are diametrically opposed to each other.
But we are all bright white, and he was bright white, so that's 4 out of 4 bright white.
Why? I mean, it is. I just find it extraordinary that you're putting so much stock on people's race. I actually think it's. I mean, I'm not an easily offended person. I'm not saying I'm offended, but I think it is somewhat offensive. But let's not get sidetracked.
You're pretending to be offended.
I'm not pretending to be offended.
Because I've called out the fact that we're all one ethnicity.
I think it's morally wrong.
Of course,
actually.
there are 3 people sitting here.
Yeah. There were 4. Let's include Stephen, because he kicked off the debate.
Obviously, 25% of the country isn't black.
Right.
And of course, we have many different people on this panel across many different weeks, of many different races, of many different hues. I actually think we probably get quite close to the average percentage in the United Kingdom.
I can absolutely assure you that you don't.
We're getting completely sidetracked from this topic.
We
can have it out about this in a separate debate, Tessa, if you'd like to. I'm always up for it.
It's an example of what happens when you don't observe EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, is you get a product that is positively discriminates in favour of the white male. And it's great. I love to see you there. You look great. Young, fresh. You got loads of energy and you push a certain line from a white male perspective.
I don't think that I
two men, 2 women.
Particularly typical of a line on many issues. I don't know. I mean, you could probably back me up on that.
Tom and I disagree very strongly on trans issues.
But Tessa, on this fundamental issue, isn't the story here not the particulars of what was being said, but the idea that a civil service that is meant to be impartial and is meant to do what the government says is actually organising, having meetings and saying, we don't like what the government is saying, how do we stop them? No. Isn't that the story here?
But they're employees. They're just pushing for better employment rights, better diversity, equality and inclusion across their range of employers. So it's a bit like, I may be a politician, but I want to join a club that supports my rights as a white woman. And all they're doing is, within the civil service, saying that actually, are we being treated fairly? Are we being given proportional advantage or promotion depending on our ethnicity, our religion, our colour? These are questions that are totally valid for any organisation or set of employees to
I just
ask.
find this identity obsession completely vile.
I'm not obsessed. You threw this debate up as one to talk
I just want to read out quickly this quote from HMRC, because I think this makes the point. And Stephen said, they said that he had exaggerated when he was just simply quoting things that were said during this meeting. So this HMRC spokesman said, the account put to us grossly misrepresents the context and content of the event, which was focused on positive contributions and progress and not about critical race theory. Now, everything that Stephen cited that was included in this report is absolutely saturated with critical race theory. Critical race theory is partisan. It is a contested position. To be against critical race theory is not to be pro-racism or anti-progress.
And what is critical race theory?
Well, critical race theory is, I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer in a nutshell, Tom, but it is a very, I would say, a highly ideological position on race that stratifies society according to intersecting identities. And it is highly contested. And if you'll just let me finish my point, Tessa, that I think that, who pays for this? It's the taxpayer who pays for this. This is not what civil servants should be doing. Now, that's not to say that people shouldn't get positions on the basis of merit. I don't think that identity should play a part. And I'm going to play the identity game here and say, as a woman, I have been invited onto certain panels, speaking engagements, where I've been told that I am being invited as a woman, or if I'm not able to do it, and they say to me, could you suggest another woman?
Okay, should we give a final word to Tessa?
Just why do we need equality, diversity and inclusion benchmarks and quotas? Just let me give you 2 statistics. In every ethnic group, a higher percentage of men than women were in higher managerial positions. That's from the gender point of view. And data for men showed that men from Bangladesh, Black Caribbean, mixed white and Black Caribbean groups were the least likely to be in managerial positions. Now, I'm going to say to you again, do you understand why we need equality, diversity and inclusion benchmarks to try and make certain people in certain groups actually access opportunities that are available to people like you, Tom?
Why not white working class boys? If it's just purely about statistics and not about
I'm afraid we are running to an ad break,
economics.
but thank you very much for a spirited conversation. Really, really appreciate it. And of course, we'll have much, much more after the break. Now, British fans say they may be served low-alcohol beer amid hooliganism fears during the Euros match against Serbia. Does Britain have a drinking problem, or do we need a drinking problem? Well, I'll be speaking to a former Premier League football manager next.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mervyn Kirsch was a boy when the war began. By D-Day, he was trained and ready to fight after years waiting.
It was taking a long time. I suppose I was an agitator.
He remembers reality unfolding to the sound of thumping guns.
In the morning, about 5 o'clock, they woke me up to say we were going towards France now, and I could see the outline in the dawn, and I could hear couldn't see, but I could hear the shells, big shells going overhead both ways. Nobody was bothering to fire at me, which was quite good. Then I began to feel nervous, and I sort of realised it's not just an adventure, it's actual World War.
Mervyn served in the Ordnance Regiment. His job was to get supplies like ammunition and vehicles onto the beach. When an advance party, including some of his friends, were destroyed, Mervyn stepped up.
The head of me went a reconnaissance unit. We were supposed to go on D+6. The reconnaissance unit was going D+2 to find a suitable site for 200 drivers and 1,000 vehicles, which we were going to stock, all kinds. They went across, but they didn't get across. They were torpedoed, the only boat torpedoed that day. I was put on a boat that night, any boat, going across, and told to find a suitable site for vehicles and men. So I just crossed over, and I landed, got to the top of the cliff, and just with a strange driver in a track vehicle, told him just to drive down one of the roads and see what we can find.
The People's Channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
she could have said storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation at 10 to 9. My name's Tom Harwood. Now, German police have reportedly demanded that British fans are served beer that's only 2.5% alcohol. This amid security concerns for the Euro 2024 match against Serbia. Officials claim that there's a high risk that hooligans from both sides will cause violence both in and around the stadium. Well, first Spanish residents protest against British tourism, and now concerns of hooliganism from the Germans. Have we made a bad name for ourselves? Joining me now to discuss this is the former professional football player and manager, Tony Cottee. Tony, thanks for joining me. Firstly, were you surprised when you heard that we get half-strength beer? What is this?
Yeah. Well, I can speak for experience, Tom, having followed my team West Ham across Europe this year. Going to Germany, I can tell you the beer is very strong in Germany, so perhaps there's a reason and a thinking behind it. But I think a lot of the problem, Tom, is going to be the 8 o'clock kickoff, and I think there will be serious concerns. The fans are there; they're there to enjoy themselves. We know that, but when you're around all day in the hot sunshine, if you're drinking lots of beer, you know it can get a bit steamy come kickoff time. So you know if they are going to be serving reduced alcohol lager, that's probably a good idea, and obviously anything that can prevent any sort of hooliganism. We don't want that happening in this tournament.
And I suppose the big question with hooliganism is this something that sort of naturally bubbles up from people who are very excited about the game? Or crucially, are there people who simply turn up because they're looking for a fight?
Well, I think historically, as we well know, I'm old enough. You don't look old enough, Tom, but I'm certainly old enough to remember the 70s and the 80s and the horrible things that were going on at football grounds. So, we've made great progress in football. The authorities, the FA, the Premier League, UEFA, FIFA, they've all made great progress in curbing hooliganism, but it is still there. I'm not going to pretend tonight that it's not still there. There will be a very small group of both Serbian fans and England fans that are probably actually going out there and looking for a good punch-up. And you can't say otherwise. And, I don't condone that. I fully want the fans to go out there and, watch their team, follow their country, and in a way represent the country as well, because we want the English fans to go out there, behave themselves, and we want England to bring the trophy, and we don't want to have headlines of people fighting.
Why is it football hooliganism? Why don't we see rugby hooliganism or cricket hooliganism or rowing hooliganism?
I think a lot of it is to do with the passion of the game. I think we all love football. Most people in this country love football, and we all get so passionate, so animated about it. And you can't take the passion out of the game. And sometimes that passion turns to anger if your team loses, or if you've been drinking all day, like I say. Things can turn a little bit ugly. But one thing I will say, Tom, they are very strong, the German police. As I say, I experienced it myself, earlier this year, and they won't take any prisoners. They won't mess around. And that is actually good news, because there's a lot of fans going out there. They want to enjoy the football. They don't want to be intimidated, and they certainly don't want thugs from either Serbia or from England causing trouble.
Is this, to some extent, the Germans being frankly, a bit more efficient than we were? After all, when there was that Euros final in Wembley, it was a disaster.
Yeah, it was. I mean, let's not forget it was COVID times, and it was almost like a perfect storm for that final. You're referring to the final back in 2021 when England played Italy at Wembley, and, they was awful, chaotic scenes.
People broke in, people without tickets.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that won't be happening in Germany. We're now beyond the COVID. What went on with that? We've got very, very efficient German police. They've got their policemen who will be there. There'll be a presence. You'll know they're there, but they won't look for confrontation. But I can promise you, if there is confrontation, they will sort it out very quickly. So, I'm confident that most of the fans, 95, 96 over that percent of the fans, they're going for the football. They're not going to have a fight. Of course, they want to enjoy themselves. But if there is any trouble, the German police will clamp down on it.
Well, let's hope it all goes off without a hitch, and that England, of course, make it through and through and through and get to the finals, particularly so that the pubs can stay open later here in the UK.
Let's hope so, Tom.
Tony Crotty, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Let's return to the panel now, because, Tessa, I suppose there's something about football being the national game of England that perhaps leads to more passions?
I think it includes a broader sector of the population. And from the 19th century, we even had roughs. We didn't call them hooligans. That came in the 1980s. But there are certain factors. I'm less optimistic than Tony that actually reducing the alcohol level will have any impact, because research suggests that nowadays new versions of hooliganism are much more premeditated. They're planned. They tend to take place outside the stadium. So actually, by stopping people drinking a lot inside the stadium, you're probably missing the cohort of individuals you need to target. Serbia, keen links with Russia, who delivered the major aggression in 2016 in France. It was the Russians. Let's not pretend that Russia isn't going to be involved. A lot of this goes on the internet. It's premeditated. It's often organised. I'm kind of worried. If I was an English fan, I'd be keeping my head down. I'll tell you what, my wit's about me, and I wouldn't be boozing too heavily.
Good. Just to
because it's specifically the English-Serbian game is the one that they're really concerned about.
And do you think there might be sort of central organisation to that? Is it the Russians that are organising?
Well, if you look, I think it was the 2000 championships that were hosted by Netherlands and Belgium. Netherlands were totally on it in terms of their criminal investigation, their international links. Far less hooliganism in Belgium than in the Netherlands than there was in Belgium. It's also a predominantly European problem. It didn't happen when you had the World Cup in America in 1996. Why not? Europeans solve particular countries. England's guilty, Serbia's guilty, and look at Serbia's relationship with Russia. Totally goes. We never check these things out. Balkans and Russia.
Emma Webb, what do you make of it all?
Well, just on the back of what Tess was saying, that, you know, if it is so premeditated, and particularly if it is happening outside of the stadiums in particular, what use is cutting the alcohol, the amount of alcohol content in beers? I mean, if I were a hooligan, I'd just drink more beer.
It's like when Scotland tried to stop people drinking alcohol, so they taxed it very high, or they stopped people buying it after 10 p.m. at night. And actually, if anything, alcohol consumption went up in Scotland because people just bought higher quality, higher alcohol content alcohol. And drank it at home.
Well, perhaps, I mean, maybe they're just seeing, obviously they'll be taking other measures, but maybe they're just seeing this as a sort of safeguard, an extra measure. Perhaps they just think it's common sense, make sure that it's hard, you know, they'd have to drink more quantities of beer in order to get drunk.
There will be some people who suggest, this is the Germans. This is their revenge for Brexit.
I think that might be a bit of a stretch, Tom, even now.
Some people would say you're encouraging hooliganism with comments like that. It's like that appalling tabloid headline from the 1996. Do you not remember Achtung Surrender or something bonkers that the Daily... You were probably in short trousers at the time. But yeah, very triggering, I think is the word.
Right, well, I think we have calmed down on the chance of 10 German bombers and all the rest of it. I think things have moved on. But to Tessa and to Emma Webb, thank you so much for talking through a number of very big and important stories, of course, here on State of the Nation this evening. One final question, though, which is to reflect on what has been happening in the general election. Is anyone paying attention, Tessa?
Well, from Rishi Sunak's point of view, I would say I expect he's really hoping that nobody's been paying any attention because he's had an absolute stinker of a week. But hey, glad to know that he doesn't watch your rival Sky, eh? At least he couldn't afford to when he was a child.
Although, to be honest, I don't know how many people were actually watching Sky in the early 1990s. Emma?
Well, I think it doesn't really matter what the Conservatives' policies are or what Rishi does or says. I think he could promise the world and it's not going to make a great deal of difference because I get the impression that people just simply don't believe anything that he promises. Keir Starmer is just so repetitive. You saw the clip earlier of him constantly saying that his father is a toolmaker. It's the lady doth protest too much. So we'll see when the Labour manifesto comes out tomorrow. And I think people are paying some attention, but it's the attention of a disenfranchised population. And all eyes seem to be on Farage.
Interesting stuff. Well, Tessa Dunlop, Emma Webb, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for State of the Nation tonight. But I'm not going to be throwing you over to the weather. No, instead I'm going to be throwing you over to Patrick Christie's, who's got an extra special programme coming up, dissecting a bit more about this strange election campaign. Patrick.
Yes, absolutely. I have just sat through that latest leadership event, so you didn't have to. There was unrelenting tosh from both sides there. There were gaffes, there were boos from the audience, there were laughs at times. Did you know Keir Starmer's dad was a toolmaker? Rishi Sunak was held to account as well on a few of his failures. I'm going to take you right to the heart of the action now. Yes, indeed. The battle for number 10 is raging. This crazy general election campaign took yet another twist tonight as Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer got a grilling, with both of them trying to convince the nation that they are the man to lead Britain before the polls close on July the 4th. This hour, I will take you right into the spin room. That's what you're looking at there if you're watching us on TV or on YouTube, where our political reporter, Catherine Forster, will be interviewing political heavyweights from both parties. It's going to be chock-a-block of big-name interviews. We will show you the best bits, like Mr Sunak giving this reason as to why you should vote for him.
I actually have an appalling diet because I eat an enormous amount of sugar and I'm very unhealthy in that regard.
And Sir Keir Starmer malfunctioned at this question.
You seem more like a political robot. How are you going to convince others like me to vote for you?
Well, the most...
Well, the audience got a bit lively as well.